Thank you, team, for leading us in worship this morning. Today, our team, one of our teams is also at Living Waters Methodist Church. If you remember, about a month ago, we had a team from Living Waters join us, and they led us in worship. And today, it's our turn to go over to Living Waters, and we are thankful that we are part of, sister churches, a group of churches that can serve together, learn from each other, and also support one another. We continue in our sermon series on the book of Ruth. We are in the third week on the book of Ruth. We're just coming to the end of the first chapter. And I want to thank Amber for remembering the themes in the book of Ruth. And we have heard that read out for us just now, the themes of kindness, of God's providence, that God uses everyone, and the theme of redemption. I think the details of the story that we are reading so far in chapter 1 actually heightens and sharpens God's work of redemption. Learning about how, the women, Ruth and Orpah, they were Moabites, that sharpens the work of God's redemption. To hear about what I think is their leaving from Judah in a time of the judges where everybody just did whatever they saw fit, heightens God's work of grace in that family. God doesn't need to save them, right? Isn't that the point? God doesn't need to save us. We have done nothing that is of worth to deserve God's grace, yet He redeems us. Yet He sees fit to bring us and draw us to Himself, not with the righteousness of our own, but only because of the grace of God. And so I want to encourage us, let's press on in our study of the book of Ruth. Let's look at all the details because they do sharpen God's work of redemption. They do help us appreciate God's grace and God's work in this family, as in Naomi's family. In the first week, we spoke about how there was no king, and there was a rebellion because there was no king, and there will be a king, which is the message of redemption through Ruth's giving birth to Obed. And then, of course, we learn that this leads us to Christ, who then is the king who will bring about restoration of justice and righteousness in the world. Last week, we spoke about repentance, how we all need to change. If we repent of our sins, then we need to do something about it. We can't just stay where we are and expect to change. We need to do something in our repentance. We spoke about the rescue of God, how God still came through for the people of Israel, and how Naomi returned in faith. Now, one of the questions that came up in our study materials, and I understand some of you may have struggled to fully kind of answer this question, is question 5 in our study, where the question asks, from the reading of the book of Ruth, why did Naomi's return to Judah require faith? And that's a great question. If you couldn't answer it, it's fine. I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts on how we arrived at this question. So, why did it require faith? After all, she was returning home to Judah, Moab and Judah, not extremely far away. It's not like coming from Egypt or something. It's still within, I suppose, traveling distance. Of course, it is difficult to travel in those days, but not impossible for her to return to Judah. So why did it require faith? Now, let me suggest some reasons why I think Naomi's return to Judah requires faith. And the first is this. The first is Naomi's age. She's been living in Moab for at least 10 years. She's a little bit older now. Her sons are of marriageable age. So even if she had gotten married and had them when she was younger, she would still be quite old. Right? I mean, we learn this, of course, when she tells her daughters to go, leave her because she is too old to have a husband. So she is definitely a little bit older by this time. And we talk about aging in place, right? I mean, in Singapore, we talk about how our seniors should be allowed to age in place. And that's exactly what would have been comfortable for her, I think. It would have been comfortable for her to age in place, to remain in Moab into her old age. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is quite interesting, and you might not have observed this, but if you look carefully at the book of Ruth, you will see that actually Elimelech came from an important family in Bethlehem. How do we know this? Now, we know this because in verse 2 of Ruth chapter 1, we are told specifically that they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. Now, what is Ephrathites? How many of you looked this up? Okay, if you looked it up, you will see several references. Now, it actually comes from Genesis 35. They journeyed some distance. This is as they were journeying to Ephrath, which became Bethlehem later on, right? And so in Micah, we see these two names put side by side, Bethlehem, Ephrathah. So what we see here is that this family, the family of Ephrathah, is a important family. Now, what is a way of understanding this? For example, how many of you know where the name Seattle comes from? Okay, that's a city in America, right? Seattle, it comes from the name of the chief of one of the communities there, the native communities there, and the chief's name is Siak. And so when they anglicized that name, it became Seattle. All right, so Ephrathah is also a name for Bethlehem. Now, what this means is that it is very likely that Elimelech's family was an aristocratic family. They were like the founding members of this city, right? And then eventually the town became known as Bethlehem Ephrathah. So these two words are used almost synonymously as the same city. Now, why is this important and why is this significant? Okay, by the way, in Ruth 4, you see this mentioned. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. It's the same place, actually. In Ruth chapter 1, when they return, we're going to read about this in our text later, we learn that the whole town was stirred up. Now, Naomi wasn't just some nobody. When she came home, people heard about it. She was the gossip of the town. She was certainly someone who wasn't just an ordinary person. She didn't come from an ordinary family. And so it is likely, and listen to me, it is likely that when they left Judah in the time of the famine, they were one of the few families with the means to do so. Do you understand what I'm saying? Imagine here in Singapore, there is a big economic crisis, and many people feel that we don't want to remain here anymore, we want to leave. Okay? So just say with me. And then there are these families, maybe from old money or they're very wealthy, and they have the means to get out of Singapore and live in another country where perhaps the situation is much better. And then who is left behind? Okay, not you guys, because you're all very well-to-do, you know. I will be left behind, okay? So there'll be some who will be left behind. The common folk will be left behind, those who have no means to leave, Singapore, right? To find a better place to live. That could be what Naomi was facing. She comes home and people are like, you left us when things were bad. And now you come back when things are good. There is a certain stigma surrounding her social situation. The third is this, her economic situation. She says, I leave full. Full can be interpreted in various ways. It could be full because my family is all with me, my husband and my sons. But it could also be interpreted from the perspective of prosperity. She left with means, and now she returns without means. And most importantly, she returns without her husband and her sons. Now, in that day, it is clear that a woman's economic situation is tied closely to her husband and her husband's family. Because only the men, only the line of the men will own land for them to be able to, to grow crops and to earn a living. And Naomi actually acknowledges this because when she tells her daughters-in-law to leave her, she says, each of you find rest in the house of your husband. He's trying to tell them, I'm a widow. I'm not going to be able to provide for you. But if you leave me and you find a husband, then that husband will be able to provide for you. And so certainly her economic situation was not an easy one. But she didn't have to chase her daughters-in-law away if she was still living in Moab. But if she was to return alone, then her economic situation would be truly dire indeed. And finally, she would have no social support. It's the same thing. She will be all alone. Her family has died. She'll be all alone. No one to help her and no one to offer her company. And so we come now. I hope that helps a little bit with this question. I hope, as you grapple with it in your life groups, you had a good time speaking about it. But there are details that we really do need to look at and study closer if we are to come to a fuller understanding of how each of the characters would have been feeling and what the narrator of the story is trying to tell us. Let's go now to Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 to 22. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Lord Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you know, and I've shared this many times, I've climbed Mount Kinabalu 3 times. The first time I went with a group of friends in my life group of several of us. I made it to the last checkpoint, passed the last checkpoint, but I was overcome with altitude sickness, and I had to hang back, I had to stay back. Now, I encouraged the rest of the team to go ahead, but I think the rest of the team also took the opportunity to say, I'm also very tired, we won't go. We will stay with you, Jeremy. And so they stayed with me. Only one man from our party submitted. One person went up, and then we all came back down. The rest of us did not submit Mount Kinabalu. The second time I climbed, which was about a year later, I trained much harder. I came prepared. I worked out a lot more. I was skinnier, I was fitter, and I took some drugs to acclimatize to the altitude, right? And so I was all ready to go. And the best part is when people found out that I wanted to go, one of my friends who was a doctor said, I will come with you and I will monitor your condition, right? I will keep an eye out for you and make sure that you're all right as you climb up so you'll make it to the summit. So I was very thankful for that, and he agreed, and so we went on the climb together. However, as we came to the night checkpoint, we stayed the night. The next morning, early in the morning, at about 2 a.m., it started to rain. And it rained like it was just storming. It was crazy. And then we looked up, we said, there's no way, we can't even see beyond 5 meters away. And it was really, really heavy. And the guide came along and said, sorry, you can't summit. He said, can we wait the rain out? No, you can't. If you can't, you have to go now because it's a granite surface at the top, right? And you can't, it'll be a waterfall up there. And then he adds these words that really rub, salt into the wound. He said, it only rains 3 times like this a year. So he means you are just really unlucky, right? And so we couldn't summit. We went down the mountain. Now, about a year later, I started to put feelers out. I said, I want to climb Mount Kinabalu again. Why? Because I have to make it to the summit. How can I climb this mountain twice and not get to the top? And so I started asking people. By this time, news has spread. Everybody knows you climb Mount Kinabalu with Jeremy, you won't make it to the summit. So, I went asking. Nobody wanted to come with me. Everybody said, no, you go, so we'll pray for you, But one guy, his name, of course, is Roger. And Roger comes along and says, I heard that you want to climb Mount Kinabalu. I said, yes, I will go with you. I said, you sure? Maybe you cannot make it to the top, He said, never mind. Where you go, I will follow. I will go with you. True story, okay? And we made it. Actually, we made it to the summit, and it was wonderful because I managed to officiate his wedding. And I told his wife, last time he said, where you go, I will follow. Now, he said to you, his wife. And it was wonderful, and we made it to the summit. But I was always struck by his loyalty, as a friend. He saw that I was sort of trying to find somebody. Nobody was willing to go with me. And he took the risk. He knew that Jeremy does have a good track record on this, but he was willing to go. Now we looked at some themes in the book of Ruth. And now we come to the passage that speaks about kindness. About the kindness that Naomi experiences from Ruth and her 2 daughters-in-law. We see this, of course, in verse 8, where Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, go return each of you to your mother's house, but may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The suggestion here is that the daughters-in-law have been extremely kind towards Naomi. In fact, towards her whole family. And now Naomi is giving a blessing, the same form of kindness that she has received from these 2 daughters-in-law. She now says, well, may the Lord also deal kindly with you. And the word here that is used is hesed, which speaks of loyal love. It's a very difficult word to translate. It occurs 245 times in the Old Testament. Most of the time, it's translated as love, steadfast love, loving kindness. But there really isn't one English word that captures the meaning of this. Grace, yeah, but not quite fully also. Grace is somewhat different, right? Because grace is something that, God does to us that we don't deserve, right? But this kindness carries much more than that. It carries some form of loyalty, of a covenantal kind of love. Now, often in the Old Testament, when this word comes up, it speaks about how God institutes a covenant with His people. And the relationship that they share is hesed. That is the relationship that they share. A very loyal form of love. Now, it's important to note that it doesn't just apply to God. Here, in this context, we see that Ruth and Orpah, the daughters-in-law, have dealt kindly with their mother-in-law. And so now the mother-in-law, Naomi, is praying for them that they may too experience that kind of love. But in Ruth, we actually see, in the book of Ruth, we actually see 2 more uses of this word, or rather this word occurs 2 more times, and once it applies to Boaz in chapter 2. And so Naomi says now that, Boaz is the one who is kind towards us, towards the dead, in fact. So Boaz expresses this loving kindness, this hesed. In Ruth chapter 3, again, Boaz now says to Ruth, you have expressed this kindness. Now, the phrasing is also interesting in Ruth chapter 1. Now, in Ruth chapter 1, we see this term that is used, and it's not often used with conjunction with hesed. It is this word that we translate into deal kindly. Now, we see this only a few times in the Old Testament, and many times it actually relates to those who are not from Israel. Now, we see in Joshua chapter 2, when the people, the tribe of Joseph was trying to conquer the land. That's Judges chapter 1. We see that they were trying to conquer the land, and they sent out spies, and the spies saw someone coming out from the city that was a Canaanite. And they said to him, show us a way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. So that's to a foreigner. Now, the same thing happens in Joshua, where they were trying to conquer the land of Jericho, the city of Jericho, and the same thing happens. The spies go say to Rahab, right? We've heard this story before when we did the sermon series on the book of Joshua, and they say to Rahab that, or rather Rahab says to them, would you deal kindly with me and my father's house? And the men reply, if the Lord gives us this land, then we will deal kindly with you. And so here we have Ruth receiving these words, Ruth and Orpah receiving these words. And Naomi prays that God would demonstrate that same love, that same loving kindness towards them. Now, this prayer is actually quite interesting. Okay, if you look carefully at this prayer, Naomi says it's not really a prayer, but she kind of invokes the name of God. She says to them, first, that God uses the divine name here, Yahweh, if that's how we render it. May Yahweh deal kindly with you. Now, this is interesting. Why? Because the daughters were living in the land of Moab. They haven't returned to Judah yet at this point. They were still in Moab. Yet, Naomi invokes the name of God. The divine name of God, the personal name of God. This is not just a generic God. This is the God of the Israelites. Now, Moab have their own gods, chief of which is Chemosh, who is the Moab god. But Naomi invokes the name of Yahweh when he addresses her Moabite daughters-in-law. Now, this suggests that Naomi saw that the power and authority of God of Israel extends beyond the borders of Israel. That Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the God of all nations, of all lands. In fact, extending into Moab, where Chemosh is the local god. Now, on the surface, this appears that Naomi expresses profound faith in God. Unfortunately, we'll see later that when she dismisses Orpah, and she makes reference to that to Ruth, she actually says that Orpah will return to her people, but also her gods. So it's a little bit difficult to see where her faith in this really is expressed. The second thing is that she invokes the divine name of God in the affairs of this family that will soon be separated. Now, you could argue that Yahweh, because he's the God of Elimelech's family, that as long as the daughters-in-law stay with the family, there was some form of relationship, there was some form of connection with this God. But when she dismisses them, she still invokes the name of God, suggesting that God is interested even in the matters in the lives of families that do not worship Yahweh. Imagine that. that God is interested in the affairs of families who do not call Him God. He is still interested in them. And she invokes this covenantal term of hesed, that even though they may be foreigners, God will extend His covenantal love, His loyal love, His kindness towards them. And here we see Ruth's response. We see Ruth's response as one of commitment and loyalty. She now comes to Naomi and she says, well, my loyalty to you, my loyalty to you does not end just with your sons or your family. My commitment to you continues, even though they are now gone. Now we see that Naomi tries 3 times to convince her daughters-in-law to leave. The first time, she tells them, please go. She offers the blessing. And both of them say, no, we will return with you to your people. She is, I think, in history, the most popular mother-in-law. Right? I mean, we always hear about the tensions that mothers-in-law have with their daughters-in-law. We never hear about the daughters-in-law being so close and so intimate with their mothers-in-law that they say, well, no, we will return with you. So she tries a second time. And she extends the reason in the second time, the reason why they shouldn't follow her, because she has no more sons. And at this argument, the second time, Orpah is convinced. She weeps, she kisses her mother-in-law, a sign of a farewell, and she leaves. But Ruth clings on to her. Now I'm thinking that at this point, Naomi must be thinking, one more time, this one will also leave. Right? And so she tries again, and she tries to convince her by saying, look, your sister has really gone back to her people and to her gods. So that's a bit of irony there. Even though she had just invoked the divine name of God, a blessing upon them, but she said, well, Orpah has now returned to her people, but she added, but also to her gods. And she's telling Ruth now, please leave, return after your sister-in-law, suggesting that Ruth should return back to her people, certainly, but also to her gods in Moab. But Ruth says, no, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. Here we see such profound loyalty. This sense of covenantal faithfulness we see displayed in Ruth. That yes, Naomi prays for God's blessing upon them, but only because she has experienced such loyalty and such love from her daughters-in-law. It is so unwavering. The 3 sets of dialogue, I think, suggest to us, this is not some paiseh thing, okay? This is not like when you're in a restaurant and say, would you have it, first time must say no, last bao, right? Okay, would you have it second time? Please have it, and then the third time, then you can accept, right? I don't think that's what is trying to be expressed here. I remember when we started Nathan on his piano classes about 2 years ago, we tried with this music school, and it was quite expensive. You had to pay for 6 months in advance. And so, we asked him, first time, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you're going to practice? And he say, yes. Then we look at the money, sum of money. Wow, it's quite a lot of money. Better ask again. So we ask him a second time, are you sure? You got to practice, you got to go for lessons. And he said, yes, I want to do this. And then we look at it again, we say, we ask him a third time. And I think this time, secretly in my heart, and I think in Jolene's house also, maybe he will say no. If he says no, then if he says no, then we'll save a big sum of money, right? But he didn't. He said yes. But in the end, he still never practiced now. But this is not like that. I think Naomi was really sincere. You know why she was sincere? Because she saw her predicament. She saw the faith it took for her to return. She did not see a bright future. If you read through the whole book of Ruth, you will see that she was dependent on Ruth for survival. Now, if Ruth didn't go with her, she was going to a very destitute situation. She was going to a very destitute situation, a very difficult situation. She would have no way of surviving. She knew that. She knew that without her husband, without her sons, her future was bleak. And she knew that for Ruth, if she does not get a husband who will care for her, who will provide for her, Ruth will end up in the same bad situation as her. Yet Ruth's loyalty was unwavering. Such commitment. And this leads us to Ruth's confession, her total surrender to Naomi. This is what she says. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And she invokes a curse upon herself. She says that, may the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Such deep language, such deep curse that she puts on herself. She is leaving herself no place to change her mind later. She's absolutely committed, fully in. Now, I want to show you some things in this passage, which I thought is quite interesting. Now, here she says to Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. That's fine. Your people will be my people. But then she also says, your God will become my God. Now, that's significant. What did she know about this God? We don't know. It's not clear at this time, at this point of the story. It's not clear if Naomi or Elimelech's family have been practicing the Jewish religion, Jewish faith. Certainly they didn't have any temples to make offerings, but were they practicing the religious laws of the Israelite people? We don't know. We don't know what Ruth thought she knew about this God. Yet, she said, I will go. I think this is a confession, not just of loyalty, but also a confession of faith. Now, if you look later on in Ruth chapter 2, Ruth had to give up a lot to follow Naomi. Boaz actually suggests in Ruth chapter 2 that Ruth's father and mother were still alive, that her parents were still alive. So by following Naomi, she was actually abandoning her biological parents back in the land of Moab. But the most important thing is that she also abandons the God of her land. The gods of her land that she had grown up worshiping. Now we see, of course, I mentioned this earlier, when Naomi says to Ruth, describing what Orpah had done, there was three things that she brings up. First, she has gone back, land, a place, a geographical location. She has gone back to her people, but also to her gods. Now, but earlier, in the second set of conversation that they had, Orpah and Ruth said to Naomi, we will return with you, but only to your people. If you compare these two, verse 10 and verse 16, you will see that Ruth has added an additional dimension to her following of Naomi. At first, when she was with Orpah, it was just, we'll return with you to your people, right? We'll go with you, we'll go to your people. But now Ruth adds an additional dimension of following your God. And if you look carefully in verse 17, the curse that she invokes on herself, in the Hebrew, it's the divine name of God. She actually invokes the divine name of God. And I think these verses serve as a confession of loyalty to Naomi, but also the confession of her faith to God, of her total surrender to Naomi and her God. I think this is interesting because whether she fully understood this or not, she still made that confession. I'm reminded, sometimes we feel in our day and age, being so intellectual and we're full of a generation of knowledge, we feel that in order for us to believe in God, in order for us to follow Jesus, we must first understand everything. We must first understand this, understand that, understand doctrinal Trinity, understand the divinity and humanity of Christ, understand whether it's predestination or not. We feel like we need to understand all of this in order to express faith and trust in God. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always a place for intellectual engagement and apologetics, but I think faith begins with complete surrender to God, even before we fully understand what this means. This is what I think is classically expressed by Anselm of Canterbury in 1078, where he writes that faith is seeking understanding. Faith, in another translation, faith seeking intelligence, trying to understand what our faith is. This is what he writes. I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but rather I believe in order that I may understand. And friends, in our life situation, in the things that we go through each day, in our circumstances, I believe that should also be our posture. If you go to God and say, God, before you call me to do this, tell me, help me understand everything. Tell me your plan. I want step A, B, C, D. I want a budget in an Excel spreadsheet. I want a 10-year direction. I want a strategic plan. I want all of it laid out before I will go. I think that is misplaced. We start with faith, and God shows us the way. In everything that we do, in our very belief and trust in God, we begin with faith. In each and every single day that we live, in each plan that we have in our hearts, we begin with faith. With each call that God puts on our minds, we begin with faith. And trust that God will show us the way later. Finally, we see Ruth's company in her commiseration with Naomi. So the two of them return, and I think Naomi must have been glad for Ruth's company. When she returns, she says, I'm empty. I come back empty. And I said earlier, it could be her economic situation, but it also could be her family ties. She comes back with nobody. And the narrator takes pains to emphasize Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. There is a double layer here. Naomi returned, fair enough. She came from Judah, right? So she returned to Bethlehem. She returned. For Ruth, this was her first time out of Moab. This was her first time in Bethlehem. She didn't return to anything. She was going with Naomi. And the narrator says, Ruth the Moabite, specify that, from the country of Moab. Almost as if to suggest to us what a big cost it was for Ruth. For Ruth to be part of this story of redemption, for Ruth to be part of God's plans for an heir to the throne of David, and for Christ, Jesus, to be born through this line. Ruth gave up everything, but she also went because she shared in the same sorrow that Naomi shared in. The same loss, the same tragic bereavements that she has experienced. Ruth, the Moabite, is the only one who remains with her. And we see the determination. We see Naomi saying she was, we see her, expressing such commitment to Naomi that Naomi saw that determination, that she kept quiet and stopped trying to convince her. I think this is an important lesson for us to learn. Commiseration. To spend time in the company of those who are suffering, for those who are in need, for those who are in pain. I used to enjoy watching World War II movies, like Band of Brothers and all those World War II shows. I mean, they're all very, I suppose, a bit gory, a little bit, but, it's a guy kind of show, right? I mean, stories of war. I remember watching one show, and in this, I can't remember the title of the movie, but I remember this image so stuck in my mind when they were in the trenches, they were fighting, and in the heat of battle, one of the soldiers was struck by the enemy outside the trench, so in the no man's land, right between the enemy and the trenches that they are in. And this man was struck by a bullet, and he was just crying out. He was in pain. He was bleeding out, and it was a very gory scene. But you could tell that this man was going to die. Now, one of his friends from the platoon saw this man lying out there in no man's land, and then he looks up and he hears the cries, and he gets ready to get out of the trench to go and rescue his friend. But the sergeant screams at him, "No, don't leave. Don't get out." He screams at him and shouts at him, "Stay down. It's not worth it. He's going to die. He's going to die. It's not worth saving." And then this man continues to climb out the trench, runs to his friends, where his friends was at, and pulls him back to the trench. But by the time they get back, the man was dead. The sergeant screams at his, this man who had gone out and said, "You see, it wasn't worth it. He was going to die anyway. You could have been killed out there. It was not worth it." But this man looked at his sergeant and said, "Well, I think it was worth it. Because when I got to him, he was still alive. And the last thing he said to me was this: 'I knew you would come.'" I love that scene. In the moments of death, the comfort that he brought was worth it, even if it would risk his life. Ruth saw that what she gave up was worth it, even if it meant a hopeless existence with Naomi. Now you've got to understand, Naomi didn't know the ending to the story at this. Ruth didn't know the ending to the story at this point. She didn't know that she was going to meet Boaz and they're going to have a child together and they're going to have the land redeemed. She didn't know any of that. But it was worth it because she saw the plight that Naomi was in and she sought to offer her comfort. How do we apply what we have learned today? I think there are two things that we can do with what we've heard this morning. The first is this. I think we can grow in showing kindness to others. In Ruth chapter 1, we've read earlier about how the Lord dealt kindly, how the daughters-in-law have dealt kindly with Naomi. And so Naomi now offers such a blessing to her daughters-in-law. I think there is a relationship here about dealing kindly and understanding what this means. There's a relationship here with the Levitical laws that we read. You see, in Leviticus, the law of the land of Israel is that when a stranger comes to your land, you shall treat that stranger as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. Because Israel, you were once strangers in Egypt. Without knowing, these two Moabite women have actually unknowingly obeyed a Levitical law. They have welcomed Elimelech's family into their land, and they have treated them with kindness as if they were natives of the land. This suggests to us that caring and loving and showing kindness towards those who may be strangers is an important attribute that all who follow God, all who follow Jesus, must carry. Hebrews 13 says this: "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers." In Matthew 25, we read, Jesus saying these words, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. This is important. Showing kindness to strangers is important. It is an attribute that God desires in His people. In Romans 15, we read that we are to welcome or accept one another as Christ has welcomed us, as Christ has accepted us. I pray that we will be such a church. We will be such a church that where a stranger enters, where someone who is a guest among us comes into our community, we will welcome them. We will welcome them just as Christ welcomes us. What are some ways that you can do that? Can I encourage us? Would you come early for Connect Corner, maybe once a month? I'm not saying do that every week because we have families. I understand it can be challenging to get out of the house early and on time, but we could come early just once a month. Hang out at the Connect Corner. Who knows, there would be a guest who will be there looking for someone to attend service with. Do you know how difficult it is to walk in here alone and kind of like feel that this is church? It's very challenging. But we can all express kindness to those who may be visiting us. Another way that you can do that is to sit with someone you don't know at our next communion lunch. At the next communion lunch, make it a point to sit with someone you don't know. It doesn't matter, okay? It doesn't matter whether the person has been here for 10 years or this was his first day at church. It doesn't matter. You know why it doesn't matter? Because you don't know them. If you don't know them, they just as well is a first-time visitor to our church, just as you are to them. I think with the exception of Kwok-on, who knows everyone in our church, I think all of us would not know someone who is in our community. However small we are, I think there are still strangers among us. We can show kindness and hospitality to each other. Another way that we can do that is through your pledges. You know, our budget for this year, a significant part of it goes to our ministry. And part of that ministry is our outreach and social concerns, where we support the needs of our community around us. Through your pledges, you help the church to plan our finances better so that we can support more people. We can be kind to other people, just as Jesus said, to feed the hungry, just to show the love of God. And in so doing, we show hospitality and love to Jesus. So would you consider your pledges? You know, as of last week, 57 members and 17 friends have pledged. This means we have more friends who pledged this year than last year, but that means that many of our members, you haven't submitted your pledges. Now, it doesn't matter what amount you pledge, be obedient to God's leading. But I encourage us, would you pledge as a way that we as a church together can show kindness and love to those in our community? And finally, I think we can show our commitment. We should take our commitment to follow Jesus seriously. We should take our commitment to follow Jesus seriously. I'm just going to bring you through this and we're done, okay? Look, I looked at this conversation that Ruth has with Naomi, and I see 5 things that Ruth says. The first thing she says to Ruth is this. She says to Naomi. The first thing that Ruth says to Naomi is this: where you go, I will go. This is a sign of saying, where you direct me, my life direction now, I join with yours. It's an indication of her commitment, her surrender to follow Naomi's direction. The second thing she does is she says, where you lodge, I will lodge. She gives up her home. She says, my home I leave behind. I will make my home with you. The third thing she says is, your people will be my people. Fourth thing she says, your God will be my God. But the fifth thing she says is, where you die, I will die. And that suggests her future is in Naomi's hands. Direction, home, people, God, future. That is what Ruth gave up to follow Naomi. I wonder for us whether Ruth is a model of what it means to follow God and to follow Jesus. I said earlier, her faith in God is such an example for us. That while she didn't know the full extent of her commitment to Naomi, she went ahead. and did it. She didn't know the full extent of what it means to follow God, follow Yahweh, yet she went. You know, Luke 14 says this to us. Jesus says, if anyone comes to me, does not hate his own father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. I think Jesus demands the same from us. What Ruth gave to follow Naomi, Jesus demands for us to follow him. To surrender to him our life direction, our home, who we consider as our friends, our people, and our futures. You know, when you became a Christian, you adopted the church to be your people. This is your family. This is your community. And this is your home. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And the best part is this. I think Jesus is the one who first gave up everything, who lost his life for our sakes, so that we can be redeemed and reconciled to him. We sang earlier, freely he gave. Would you now freely give your life to Jesus? Let's receive God's blessings. Brothers and sisters, will you go in peace to follow the Lord? Will you say to Jesus, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Where you die, I will die. And where you are raised, I will join with you one day in the resurrection. And so go, and may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and remain with you now and forevermore. Amen. Please be seated. The service is over.